Hello everyone, NecroVMX here, and I've been on YouTube now for 11 years doing gaming content, and the one thing that I've never actually done is a gaming review. Seems weird, right? I mean, back in the day when I did request videos of whatever random retro games you guys would throw at me, I'd get all types of comments telling me my review sucks. But I wasn't actually reviewing these games. I mean, I did give my opinion on them a lot of the time, most of the time, but it was all off the cuff as I played the game, sometimes for the first time, and always for just a few minutes. These were never reviews. They were basically commentary videos in which I would give a first impression of a game. I've since moved towards full Let's Plays, and sometimes I'll end a Let's Play by doing a sort of review of the game, but that was just me rambling off my opinions of an entire game basically right as I beat it. It's time. As some of you who follow me on Twitch know, I'm on a sort of a project to play every SNES or Super Famicom RPG, and I've been concentrating on all the ones that I've not played. You see, I grew up with RPGs, so I've played all the major ones, your Final Fantasies, your Dragon Quest, Lufia's, Breath of Fires, but there's a lot out there that are off the beaten track that I've not played or not played all the way through for one reason or another, and usually the reason was just that the game wasn't released in the United States. If you want to see this, come by my Twitch streams on Thursday nights. That's when I play SNES and Super Famicom RPGs that I've never played through before. As of writing this review, I'm currently playing through Paladin's Quest. So, for this first review, I'm going to be covering Terranigma. First, some information. Terranigma was a Japanese action RPG developed by Quintet. It's the third part in a thematic trilogy. The first two parts would be Soul Blazer and The Illusion of Gaia, with the ActRaiser games being somewhat related as well. The reason that I missed out on this one is probably the same reason that most Americans did. It wasn't released here. Though the first two games were published in the US by Enix, by the time Terranigma came out, Enix had closed down their North American publishing branch, denying us a lot of great games. However, if you want to play this one in English, you won't need a translation patch, as it was translated to English and released in Europe. So you can actually play this one on a SNES that is modded, or you can bypass the region lock with an action replay device, or just throw the ROM onto your SNES Mini if you have one, or, just play it in an emulator like I did. I played this game, the unaltered European ROM, in the Hygan emulator for anyone who's interested to know. Terranigma is an action RPG that tells the story of Ark, or in my case, I let the chat name my character, so he wound up being called Yeetsack. Ark comes from a small village in the middle of the earth. If this seems weird, that's because this game is aggressively weird. Soul Blazer had already set the stage for weirdness to a certain extent, and The Illusion of Gaia was completely off the rails, but both of these games took place in a sort of recognizable fantasy world, just with fairly strange plots. But this game starts you off beneath the planet's surface. The overworld has a cool Mode 7 distortion to it, and you live in the only town, which has floating bubbles wandering around that they call Crystal Blue. Well, after Ark goes into an area that he really shouldn't have, everyone in the town gets frozen, and you're forced to take on several dungeons in a row before actually ascending to the real overworld, which is devoid of human life. For the longest time, you play as the only human on the planet, and you can interact with and speak to animals and plants, though later when you do restore human life to the planet, you lose the ability to speak to animals and plants. The game goes through what seems like hundreds or perhaps thousands of years, with mankind progressing to having airplanes by the end of the game, though the main character doesn't age. It's kind of suggested that he might be immortal in some way. The general gameplay is moving around the overworld from place to place, helping the planet recover from the calamity of years past. For weapons, you get a series of spears, and you can pause the game to change equipment at any time, which you do so by having the main character crawl inside of a dimensional box and visit several rooms to look at equipment and items. So let's break this into categories. This is how it's going to work. I'm going to rate the game from 1 to 10 on graphics and presentation, music and sound effects, story and writing, gameplay and controls, and balance and difficulty. I'll rank each of these, and then I'll give an average at the end, which will serve as the final score. Also, keep in mind that the way that I score things, 5 is average. So a ranking of 6 is above average, and a 7 is good. Please keep this in mind. So, for graphics and presentation, Terranigma gets very high marks. As a late SNES game, there's a lot of detail and great colors, but what strikes me the most is the sheer amount of animation in this game. The main character arc is almost never at a standstill, with fluid movements for everything and even idle animations. Most enemy sprites are also similarly well animated, and all of the areas in the game are attractive with a great amount of detail, though later in the game I did notice that NPC sprites tend to get reused a lot. There's probably only about 20 or so sprites for NPCs. There's also a wide variety of areas to visit, though you'll revisit areas a lot. And there's at least a lot of variety. Terranigma is not quite on the level that you might disbelieve that it's a SNES game, but as for attractive SNES RPGs, it is definitely in the higher tier. The presentation is also good. I loved climbing into the little box and navigating the menu, which is easy to do. Hit points and whatnot are easily seen in the minimal HUD, and you get plenty of cutscenes, usually with copious amounts of Mode 7. There's nothing really negative to say about the game's presentation, so for graphics and presentation, I'm going to give Terranigma a 9. Music and sound is another strong point for Terranigma. Comparing it to Soul Blazer and The Illusion of Gaia, the game's sound quality is more advanced, and the music itself is more memorable than Illusion of Gaia's, though I prefer the soundtrack in Soul Blazer. This is, of course, a personal preference. Terranigma has a lot of memorable themes, particularly the underworld and overworld map themes. The sound effects are perfectly serviceable, and while they don't quite scratch that nostalgia itch that Soul Blazer does, they do the job. I give Terranigma an 8 for music and sound. For story and writing, this is where it gets a little murky. Quintet has always been pretty decent at telling a story, but the fine details of writing are extremely variable. First, the positive. The characters are much better written than they were in Illusion of Gaia, and they generally stay in character, save for the moments when the story demands that they be out of character. The story is easy enough to follow at first, but that's sort of the rub. I spent the first half of Terranigma figuring out that eventually everything will be explained, but the game kept introducing new concepts to the point where at the end I was just kind of along for the ride. There are several twists that make sense in context, but the context is completely bonkers. And due to the game's reliance on nonverbal storytelling, sometimes you just have to kind of interpret what's happening. In some ways, this game is like Soul Blazer and Illusion of Gaia, accumulation of the previous two games. The concept of restoring the world comes from Soul Blazer, while traveling the world helping people and uncovering the mysteries of the past comes from Illusion of Gaia. It's a neat idea in concept, but in execution it comes off as undercooked at times, with a lot of sudden expedition dumps that can leave you just scratching your head. Terranigma isn't horribly written, and there's a chance that some of the fault here lies with the translation job. And honestly, comparing it to most other SNES RPGs, its writing isn't that bad. Games weren't known for amazing writing back then, after all. It's no Lufia 2, but nor is it a total mess. I give it a 6 for story and writing. For gameplay and controls, Terranigma is a lot of fun to play. Arc controls very well and is quite nimble in battle. You get several moves that you can pull off with mixing up the attack and jump and lunge buttons in different combinations, and it's fun to figure out what attacks will do the most damage or be the safest, but the controls are quite responsive. If you've played The Illusion of Gaia, it's actually pretty similar, with the same attacking, lunging, and blocking. The lunging can now be done separately, and you can dash and jump. Jumping can be slightly problematic at times when there are platforming sections, but the worst that happens is you do a section over. One issue I had was the game's magic system, which you use items to create spells. At least I think that's how it works. I found it to be obtuse and mostly useless, and I just stabbed everything to death with my stick. When I reached the one enemy that I was expected to use magic on, well, it just took longer to kill. I just chipped it down with Arc Spear. The game's magic system expects you to buy items and use them to create spells somehow, and I never really exactly figured it out, probably because the game never explicitly explains it, and as I'm playing a ROM, I don't have any documentation that may have come with the game. My previous point, however, can be made for a lot of the final act of Terranigma, as there is mostly an optional but rewarding city building aspect to the game where you can do small quests for people to build up the cities via economic growth, and every time a city grows, it gives you access to more items for sale. This isn't necessary, but it's very helpful if you can figure it out. However, due to a mix of the city building being a guide, dang it, of obtuse fetch quests, the game never actually tells you how you can do any of this, only hinting at it having an NPC predicting a city's growth. If you're figuring out things on your own without a guide or an instruction manual, there are a few moments that you might need to look up where to go next, especially at the end of the game when the entire world is open to you. This isn't really that big of a deal. A lot of games of the era had these moments where you just get stuck for whatever reason. I just wish things like magic and city building were better explained in-game. Despite flaws with progression, the game is almost always a blast to actually play. I give Terranigma an 8 for gameplay and controls. For balance and difficulty, there's no getting around it. Terranigma is a very, very easy game. The only difficulty that you'll run into comes from the aforementioned issues with not always knowing where to go next and not knowing how to cast magic, only made one boss battle protracted for me. Since it's an action RPG that's very fun to play, you'll find yourself killing enemies all the time, just because it's fun to do, and therefore you'll level up quite a bit. And I never had much difficulty killing a boss. As a matter of fact, most bosses went down with only a few hits, at least in the first 2 acts of the game. The difficulty does ramp up for the second half of the game, requiring you to manage your healing items, but for the most part, it's not really ever hard. Considering that I played the game without ever casting a spell or upgrading a town, I probably made it as hard on myself as possible, but I still skated through the majority of the game, as a properly leveled up Arc just wrecks just about anything with a few lunge attacks. Personally, I don't mind an RPG being easy. Final Fantasy VI is one of the best games on the system and presents almost no challenge at all. But that's also one with a very compelling story, where the main draw in Terranigma is more the gameplay than the story, so I personally would have at least wanted the bosses to put up a little bit more of a fight. So while you may occasionally get lost or feel directionless, you'll probably never lose a battle unless you've been going out of your way to avoid enemies, and it's almost never necessary to grind for money or to buy equipment or items. I always seem to have more than enough for what I needed. Overall, while I would have liked more of a challenge, especially from bosses, there really aren't any unusual difficulty spikes or frustrating parts, so I'm going to give Terranigma a 7 for balance and difficulty. Overall, Terranigma isn't as amazing as you may have heard it is, but it's definitely a very good game that is totally worth playing, whether you emulate it or get the PAL release. Its flaws merely highlight the good parts in my opinion, and although as far as the trilogy goes, I still like Soul Blazer the most overall, and the game doesn't have the charm of ridiculousness that The Illusion of Gaia has. For a non-localized action RPG, you could do a lot worse. Terranigma is a fun playthrough that will have you marveling at its graphics and humming along with its music, though occasionally finding yourself at a loss as to what to do and maybe having to look up a guide. The overall average score of Terranigma is 7.6. Remember when I said a 7 was good? Keep that in mind. Most game review sites and magazines and YouTubers seem to score on a scale from 5 to 10, with 5 being unplayable and 7 being average. I don't do that. I actually like Terranigma a lot, and I think that a 7.6 is a fair score considering that I want to use all the numbers on a scale. So with that being said, I'm going to make this a series. We're going to be reviewing a lot of the RPGs that I've played through on Twitch. Doesn't mean that you're going to get reviews of like Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger. Mostly just the kind of off-the-beaten-path games that I've played, like, for example, Terranigma, or Live Alive, or Treasure of the Rudras. And I don't necessarily have a schedule for these reviews, but I will make a playlist for them. See you next time.